If you're a worship leader or a tech director and sound is not your first proficiency, let's talk about how you can train sound techs and not get bogged down in the technical weeds. Churches need new volunteers all the time. Either the team isn't big enough and it's all resting on one person's shoulders, or you have turnover and you need to train somebody new. So if you're in that pinch, but you're more adept at lighting or IT, or making chord charts and leading the band, you gotta figure out what needs to be essential for training new people so that they can get up and running and have a successful sound set. That was a lot of S's. Hey, if you're new here, my name is James and I help worship leaders, sound techs, and tech directors eliminate the mystery and frustration around sound at church, so your in-person and broadcast sound can be its best. So here's the big picture overview of what we're doing with brand new sound techs. We're gonna start with the music first, because that's the toughest one to get right, and when you have a good idea of what it should sound like, it makes it a lot easier to move things into place and try to find the tools in order to make it sound good. Next, you need to teach them how to use the gear, and then also set them up for success with a virtual sound check and being really clear on startup and shutdown procedures. When you fine-tune your system so that it's easy to use right from the start, your sound techs can crush it much more easily. It's kind of like building a mix from scratch, and setting up the sound system is like climbing a rock wall. When we set them up for success, it's like we've built a staircase right to the top, and there's still some handholds to get all the way to the top and problems to overcome, but you can make it a lot easier for them by setting things up well. With a great starting place, most everybody can do a great job if they know what they're supposed to make it sound like. Speaking of knowing what it should sound like, the first thing that you need is to know exactly how it should sound for your congregation. There are lots of questions like, how loud should it be? Or should the music envelop people so that they can sing loud? Or should the music support people so that they can feel like they're singing with a group of people? They're hearing one another sing. How loud should the bass be? And what instruments need to be emphasized in our mix? When you can put clear language on this, it leaves less room for interpretation, so there's less creative conflict on what's right and what's wrong for your worship mix. It frames the creative decisions as what serves our congregation well, not what do you like versus what do I like. One way to do this is to do some critical listening to music together in your worship space. Play a recording of one of the worship songs in sort of the arrangement that you might do. It doesn't have to be perfect because you don't have the 12,000 layers of instruments that they had on the recording. And then start to identify the different elements and how they fit together in the mix. Take note as to what changes from the intro to verse 1 and the first chorus. Identify the primary instrument, and if there are backing vocals, where do they sit related to the lead vocal? And where should it be for your church? Maybe the background vocals should be more prominent than the recording. Maybe they need to be a little less prominent than the recording. Identify the secondary instruments and the ones that need to take a back seat in the mix versus the primary instrument. And then I always like to hammer home that the lead vocal is most important. We need to make sure that nothing is in front of that, including harmony vocals. Now, if you're training sound techs that come from more of a technical background, this might be a little bit more difficult for them to hear at first, but be patient with them and continue to hammer home that the lead vocal needs to be the loudest and the background vocals or the harmony parts need to be tucked back at least a little bit. What happens when the harmony vocal is on top of the lead vocal is people that don't have a musical background get a little bit confused because they're hearing singing, but they're not hearing the melody that they're used to, and they might not identify what the problem is, and they would have a harder time singing along. And one of the goals of leading worship is to help people sing along. So we want to make sure that the melody is out in front and not covered up by anything else. As we get into the sound booth, they need to understand the startup and shutdown procedures. This can help you eliminate some of the stuff that's on your plate because there are plenty of other things for you to take care of on a midweek rehearsal or on Sunday morning. After they know how to start things up and get around on the board in the basic way of layers and how to select channels in order to change things, the next thing that they need to understand is the difference between turning it up with the preamp and turning it up and down with the fader. The preamp adjusts the level for everything else that comes downstream. So any monitor mixers, any aux sends is going to all be affected by the preamp. In addition, if you set the preamp too high, things could clip and distort, and that sounds bad, so we want to make sure that our sound techs aren't doing that. If our preamp is set too low, we won't have enough level in the different places where the signal needs to go. The fader is used to make more balance adjustments and fine-tuning of the overall levels. When we adjust the fader, in most circumstances, it doesn't affect other things that it doesn't need to. So after we get sound check set, we move from adjusting the preamp to only adjusting the faders for most of the time. Again, if you've got personal monitor mixers on stage and somebody adjusts the preamp at the soundboard, that affects the level for everybody on that channel. That's why it's important to let them know that there's an appropriate time to change it, but it comes with communication with the rest of the team and those whom it will affect. They also need to know how to adjust things for the monitors. Sometimes somebody needs a little bit more or less of something that's getting mixed together, even if they're sent to a personal monitor mixer. Imagine that the drummer wants a little bit more overheads in his monitor mix so he doesn't bash the cymbals so hard. That would be a very wise drummer. When your sound techs understand how all the pieces fit together, then they can make wise decisions on how to adjust something so that it doesn't mess up other stuff too. You might also need to teach them how to adjust your live stream mix, and if you're getting a little bit more advanced or they're starting to notice the tone of different things or feeling like things are muddy, you can teach them about the high pass filter. If you want to learn more about the high pass filter, I made a video all about that. I'll put a link down in the description below. The next thing that you need to teach them, and maybe you need to learn it first so then you can teach them, is how to build a mix from scratch step by step. And the process that I'm about to teach you works really well because it all makes sense on how all the pieces fit together, and it keeps you from just ratcheting up or just pushing up a bunch of faders and trying to sort it out. So grab a pen or start a new memo on your phone. Let's dive in. The first thing that you're going to turn up is the primary instrument. And remember, when we were critically listening to music, we were identifying which instrument is the primary instrument. Or if this song was led with just one instrument, what instrument would that be? A lot of times it's the worship leader's instrument, but sometimes it's not. So you have to identify that first. Then you can turn up the worship leader's vocal. We want to make sure that we leave room of all the other things that we turn up for that worship leader's vocal so that we don't drown it out. You also need to pay attention to the dynamics, or how loud should it be for this part of the song when I'm setting it up, because the verses tend to be quieter and the choruses tend to be louder. So we're going to make sure that we're not setting the verses too loud so that when it goes to the chorus, it gets extremely loud. Okay, back to the balance stuff. Next, we're going to turn up the bass guitar and try to fill in the low end of our primary instrument. From here, we're going to turn up the kick drum and match the low end of the kick drum to the low end of the bass guitar. Identifying how big the low end should be for your congregation is important in the critical listening step because we can try to match that here, and when we felt it and we understand it, that's when we can replicate it. The kick drum should be the punch of the low end, and the bass guitar should be the sustain of the low end. After we've got our kick drum up, we can add the snare drum and match the level there, and then turn up a little bit of overheads. The overheads don't have to be out in front of the mix. They can be tucked back to be the subdivision. They're not the main thing where it's like kick, snare. It's like overheads are kind of gentle. You've also got to be careful because sometimes drummers get excited or angry, or who knows what's going on inside the head of drummers, but they can hit the cymbals very hard and you don't want to have the mics too loud for that. Make a mental note to come back to the toms later because the drummer won't play them for another 14 measures or something ridiculous while you're just sitting there waiting, and then you start to mix in our other secondary instruments. As you're mixing these in, push it up so that you can identify it, and then pull it back so that it's tucked a little bit behind the primary instrument. After you've done all of this and all your instruments are up and in their appropriate place, you can circle back around to your lead vocal. Is it now starting to get a little bit buried? Or in the bigger parts of the song, do you need to push that up a little bit more to stay on top? After you've revisited the lead vocal, now you can mix in the harmony vocals. This gives the background singers a chance to warm up, to get their monitor mixes set, and hopefully by this point they're actually projecting and giving you good level, although just watch out, sometimes they sing a little bit more timidly during sound check and a little bit more energetic during the service. After you have a mix built, you're not finished. Imagine that running sound is like driving a bus and you're trying to stay between the lines on the road. If you had your hands off the steering wheel the whole time, that's probably not going to stay right in the middle or make the turns that you need to. So making adjustments on the soundboard as you go is important, because one song might have the piano for the lead instrument, the next song might have a guitar as the primary instrument. You even might switch singers on who's leading what song, so you have to be always on the faders, making little adjustments as you go. Another thing to remember is that sound check doesn't always sound exactly like the service for a variety of reasons, one of which you add a bunch of warm bodies in there that are now singing along. So the things that worked during sound check was just a starting place. You have to make adjustments during the service to make it sound right, and you have to learn to trust your ears to know, hey, what I'm hearing now needs to be adjusted, even if I trusted what I did before. The next great tool that you really want to have ready for your sound techs is Virtual Sound Check. Virtual Sound Check allows us to record the band and then play back the tracks through the board on individual channels so that we can make changes to each one and hear what each one's doing without having to have the band there playing it and without having to have the congregation there hearing it too. When you can practice by yourself and make mistakes and make things sound weird and figure out what the different tools do on your soundboard, it's a lot easier to make those changes when you're in the heat of battle, either during sound check or the service. Imagine it's kind of like a guitar player that always leaves his guitar at church. He might be a good player, he might have read over the charts, but he's not going to practice by himself and make the sounds sound bad and then sound good at home. They're going to be a lot worse over time than this guitar player that takes their guitar home, practices the charts, experiments with different things, with different picks or different strings, makes all the different sounds that they want in private so that when they're in public, it sounds better. If you want help setting that up, I've got a free challenge for you called the Virtual Sound Check Challenge. It's got a list of things that you need to have to set it up and different ways that you can set it up on different soundboards and different recorders. I'll put a link to that down in the description below as well. Finally, when you're trying to clarify what it should sound like for your team, I've got a free guide for you called How to Lead Your Church Sound Team that goes through all the different things on the different parameters on what makes a good mix at church, all the different roles that have to happen on the sound team, and so that you can find the right person to put in the right place, and even ways to develop meaningful feedback channels so that you can also improve your team over time. There's a link to that down below as well. If you've already got all your objectives clarified and all your virtual sound checks set up, I'd encourage you to take a deeper dive into Attaway Audio Academy and the courses that we have there and the community that's there too. We've got courses on mixing foundations, broadcast audio, audio for worship leaders, and Amateur to Pro, which walks you through the entire sound system from sound source to destination and all the components in between. We do live Q&A every week, and it's a great place to connect with other worship leaders and sound techs that are doing what you're doing. You can find more information to that at attawayaudio.com/academy. Hey, that's it for this video. If you liked it, go ahead and mash that thumbs up, hit subscribe, don't ding the little bell because you don't need more notifications in your life. And remember, it's all about the low end, avoid the sound tech solo, and nobody leaves church humming the kick drum. We'll see you back here next time on Attaway Audio.